Welcome to the Inspirational Insights podcast. I'm very excited to have with me today Dr. Rob Lyon. Did I say that properly this time? I'm
You,
always
yeah, that's good. That works. Close enough. Let's just say that.
oh my gosh. Black River Performance Management, also though with an academic hat on for the Idaho State University, very well
Mhm.
steeped in HR practices and performance management. So his company BlackRock Performance Management does organizational development and organizational behavior
Mhm.
and then of course the HR thing. So we're chatting today about just what's going on in the HR world, but also what are the bigger picture items that have an influence on how we make decisions when it comes to people, organizations, and all of that. Rob is a fellow Canadian,
Yeah.
but not in Canada. So yeah,
But I am closer to you now where I am in the US than I was where I was from in
that
Canada.
is true. That is true. Our this country is huge, and
Yes.
yeah, so that is true, and I appreciate that. Rob, one of the first things I want to start with you is the beauty of your work is you got one foot in university and you've got the other one in practical application.
Mhm.
How far apart are those worlds right now?
Right now, I'm going to back up and say they've always been a distance from each other. And one of the biggest challenges is in the academic environment, we try to conduct research and build a body of knowledge that can be used in practice. However, we approach thoughts and language in a little bit different way than industry. And I think that's where a lot of our challenges come in. But it's also one of the reasons why industry has a lot of challenges too. Let's use, just for a simple example, the word motivation, right? A very binary concept in industry. It's either intrinsic or extrinsic. And then you get in the world of academics, and I'm teaching in the next couple of weeks, I'm teaching a class on the science of motivation. And and what you learn, if you were to go from a practice, so my students that are the grad students are going to come into this class with this really binary view, and it's just going to be blown all apart because there are a variety of different motivational frameworks and thoughts and schools of thoughts. But what's really important here that happens in academia, which doesn't happen in practice, and this is part of our challenges in practice, is that we get very specific and particular about language in academia and terms. And so when we even talk about motivation, we even have to refine it further than that to really make it granular so that we can adequately study what is it that that grain is and what are the characteristics of it, what's the impact of it, can we predict anything off of our findings, stuff like that. Whereas in industry, it's lots of big sweeping generalizations, right? And so, but that's always been that way, and it's going to continue to be that way. But where I try to occupy the space is I consider myself a translational researcher, that I take what's happening in academia and I use those granular aspects to refine my perspectives of how I help my organizations and my clients, as well as my students, right? So the fun thing about our program is that we do blend practice with science because they're in the trenches, they're experiencing this, and we need to improve and refine their understanding of what these things are. And so that's where I occupy that space in between. And we've had great experience with that because what happens is we find tools, models, systems, frameworks, and research that get published in papers. And if you look at any research paper, it's typically black and white tables, some flow, arrow, vector types of things, but to the general eye it doesn't mean anything, and not to mention it's hard enough to understand what the language is. So I'll take stuff like that is within my wheelhouse and build models around it that are really palatable and easy for my clients to use so that they don't have to know all the background. They just have what's relevant to them to do the job they're trying to do. And what we know is that the tool is sound based off of its inputs.
I love it. So, one of the things I observed in my 30 something years of facilitation experience is that that people really don't want to understand what it is they're doing. They just want to do it. And then if they do it and it doesn't work, well, then they'll just do it again. And it's like, to my mind, it was one of the most inefficient approach that I couldn't get it. So I appreciate the approach you're taking, because it's one you kind of have to, bypass the lack of curiosity about why this works or why it doesn't work. What are the nuances? Going back to the semantics, thing, the languaging being so nuanced, it really gets you into what are we really doing here, and what's and clarifying intent a fair bit, because otherwise the language is, it can be distorted, it can be manipulated, it can be weaponized to serve agendas, and we've certainly seen that with the DEI, the whole DEI thing, which is, and a couple of other words out there that are similarly being worked with. So I appreciate this. When you look at clients, when you look at the headspace people are in when they're in university, or it's in courses, how much adaptation do you find people have to do to move from one world to the other? And is there any support for expansion, both intellectually and from a consciousness point of view, from, in terms of paying attention to what's going on? How much hard work are people having to do to get real value out of that?
That's a challenging question to answer. I think what comes to mind first is that you take a group of students and they represent the bell curve. And what I mean by that is that we have students, and I'm not talking about my program, I'm talking about people in general when they go to college or university, that some of them just roll up their sleeves and dive in. They want to know it. They really want to touch it, feel it, break it down. They take it from the classroom to their home life. They talk to their family, friends, organizations about it. They integrate it at work. They see what works, what doesn't, all the way down to the other end that, in many courses, you could get by from just going through the motions as long as you're hitting the mark set up by instructors, right? And so it's at that other end, it's a superficial level of learning. It's not building deep knowledge or starting to contribute towards expertise. It's more of a transactional experience, and they're happy when they're done. Is everyone so when people are experiencing that, are they doing that in all their courses? No, not necessarily. Some courses just resonate better with others, right? It connects more. Or there's so much going on in the background of their life that I just need to stay on track and get through this quarter so that I can continue on. And I need to deal with these priorities in my personal life. They're a greater priority at that time. So it's tough. We are a program that's focused on practice and using scholarship to inform that practice. So I don't think it's a heavy lift for our students. In fact, our students really enjoy it. I solicited some feedback this week from my psychological safety course. And the consistent theme was, this is amazing stuff, and I've been living in this. I didn't know it to this level or extent, but I also didn't have a language for what I was experiencing, and now I'm learning this language. And so that's a lot of fun to see that. And then to build that bridge, I work hard to really try to communicate with my students. I'm constantly available for questions, for the resources, conversations, bounce some ideas off me, because my students are in industry, they're working. And so it's not uncommon for them to say, hey, Rob, I'm trying to navigate this challenge in my organization. The book and what you're doing is taking us through this framework. I'm finding that I'm running into some barriers or obstacles, or it's not working out. Can we talk about this? So one thing I will say is that they're not saying, oh, this isn't how it happens in my organization, because I really try to be careful to not paint anything as very linear, that everything's dynamic, everything's complex. And there's a lot of gray around all the concepts and practices we talk about. What's the bigger factor, or the people and their mindset, in the system that's influencing that. So because we've heard from other programs that, well, this is what my professor told me, and it's not like that in the workplace. And we don't get that feedback in our program. It's really nice, actually. This makes sense. I see how it's alive here. I'm running into human barriers as opposed to theoretical frameworks that are maybe not as experienced in the industry.
Yeah, yeah. That I find very interesting, because when I think back to when I'm in the 90s or something, when I was facilitating a session and a master's graduate came in and she wanted to observe, and I made arrangements with the client for her to do that, and she was pretty cross with me because what she was seeing in the room wasn't according to the book. And so she sort of said to me, "Look, you should be doing this, 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 and this." And I thought, that's just not how it works.
And that's a great example. You know? That's a great example of where our program is not wrestling. That our students, I think, really recognize that there's a lot of gray and there's a lot of variables that are at play here. And that the tools, the models, the frameworks, the theories are in many cases guiding principles or guiding practices to inform how we work through that gray.
Yeah. And I think what I want to do quickly is just differentiate between models and frameworks, because I'm allergic to models. But Dave Snowden, in the kind of, and he did a wonderful job of saying, framework is just a perceptual way of seeing things. And I thought, okay, I get that. I can work with that. It's not fixed. I can look through that lens and I can see the world through that lens, but I don't have to be attached or bonded to it. Whereas I think sometimes people in the chase for certainty use models as a crutch.
Especially if they have arrows on them. If yes, this way go. If no, go this way. And you're right, it's really rigid, and it oversimplifies some of the dynamics of what's going on, right?
Yeah, especially in complex environments. I think that's the overwhelming tendency, is to oversimplify, because there's that discomfort with uncertainty, that discomfort with ambiguity. And so the solution is just to oversimplify and then set it aside and hope but that's of course not a really, it's not a real functional strategy for the world we live in, I don't think.
Yeah, and I think when you look at our models on our page, we use the term models, but they're kind of a hybrid of the two. They're not flowcharty. There's no error. We'll say this, then that, then this, then that. The idea is that, like, if we have a performance issue, we turn to the model or the diagram or the image that we created and walk it through each of the phases. One phase does not flow into the next, but what it does is it gives us the key points for them to question, right? So if I have a performance issue, how do I make sense out of why that person's struggling? I just go off of what I know and what I've learned, right? Or go off my gut. Because if I'm a regular industry person, I don't necessarily have deep training and expertise in this stuff. But what I do is I say, okay, well, here's a way to diagnose this. Let's look at their knowledge. Let's look at their capacity, motivation. Let's look at the tools that are available. Let's look at the culture that relates this, so that now I have terms to figure out. It's kind of like the dashboard of a car. I don't know if there's anything wrong with my car until the light comes on. And it's like, oh, now I have a clue as to what next questions or next actions I should take.
Right. So I want to differentiate briefly, because when we started at the beginning, it was motivation. Quite a while ago, we differentiated between motivation and inspiration, and we sorted it out by motivation being extrinsic. Put the carrot out and you get the carrot, and then everything stops. Versus inspiration, where it's meaningful, it's got a purpose, a higher intent, if you will, and you're going for that. Does that language resonate in the environments you're in for the most part, or not?
No, and I would actually almost flip-flop those to some extent. So we have that traditional notion of the carrot and the stick for motivation, which is highly externally oriented. So right accurate with what you said. But how we're presenting this is that this is what the science tells us about motivation, and how do we leverage and harness internal motivation and actually influence the motivation and cultivate the motivation of others. So generally speaking, if we're looking at pure, real levels of intrinsic motivation, you can't motivate me. that's my belief, that's my language, that's what I tell my people, is that I can cultivate that for you by putting the right things in front of you, understanding more about who you are, your values, your priorities, things like that. And then I can elicit some of that from you and help you discover and uncover some of your intrinsic motivation. But when it comes to inspiration, I really actually, I veer away from that. And I had this conversation many years ago. Someone said, "Are you a motivation speaker or an inspiration speaker?" And I was like, if anything, it's inspiration. It's giving them an idea and a target to aspire towards.
Yeah.
I can't make anyone do anything based off of my language. Like it might inspire them to some pieces, but at the end of the day, they're autonomous individuals that are making decisions for themselves, right? And I think that's some of the problems we find with like you remember the Bush era of guns and video games and music and all that stuff that was, these are causing all these problems in these societies. And the answer is, well, it's super complex to answer that in 1 hour.
Yeah.
But a lot of it boils down to the individual behind all those ideations.
Right. And just to circle back to what you were talking about in the class, is one of the things that I was always fascinated by. And I think there's a lot of importance around learning for learning's sake, just going in and, not having to see the direct line between, if I study this, then this will happen. Not that cause effect, but just sort of exploring. I go back to Steve Jobs' experience with finding himself in a calligraphy class without knowing why he was there, but just being there. And then sure enough, later on, that morphed into a whole bunch of fonts on Apple.
Yeah.
And I love that kind of indirect, more random approach to, gosh, I'm learning this and I don't know how I'm going to apply it, but sooner or later it will pop out, and it does. Yeah. Or it doesn't.
Well, that's the power of new stuff, right? Like, and partially power of college and things. Someone just asked me the other day, like, what was your major in college? I said, which one? Like, because bopped around a bit, and they said, well, how did you find what your college major was? I said, I was actually drawn to the faculty that I got to know in one of the general courses I took. And when I started to follow them in the major, they opened up new stuff for me, like the calligraphy, or for me it was poetry, critical theory, gender studies, stuff like that I had no idea about, that then has downstream shifted all of my life in terms of how I process information, what I do. My wife's doing some stuff on her book right now. And I actually had to say, wait, that violates some of the rules for my poetry class. We need to look at those metaphors and how they're structured if you're going to talk about this like this. And this was just last week. It's kind of crazy because that's been decades ago.
Yeah. Interesting. My last, the episode that I did was with Curtis Michelson, and we were talking about AI. So I'm going to pivot now and steer into that territory. We were looking at AI, but we were also looking at it in terms of how do we decide what our relationship is with it. Okay. And so in terms of deciding, do I use this? Is it going to replace me? Is it going to augment my existing, like my decision making, my intel, whatever direction you want to take that. So what do you see as being the relationship between HR, or performance management on a wider scale, and AI? And here I want to particularly explore the implications on decision making, and people just deferring to it. Are they using AI to scan all their resumes and skip potential and just go for the data? What I know there's a lot of facets to this, but so pick on any one of them and go for it.
Well, let's start with resumes, right? So one of the things that are happening right now because of AI is that talent acquisition managers are receiving hundreds of resumes that look the same.
Oh, wow.
And so, here's the posting, here's the language, here's my attributes, and make me look good. And so there's a new challenge that's emerging that in that talent screening criteria area. I'm lucky I don't live in that space. I don't know what the outcome of that's going to be. I did see just the other day on LinkedIn, which was really neat, that one of the AI companies said we will not permit any AI generated resumes, which I thought was really awesome to do that. We do a lot more boutique hiring strategy, so the applicant pool is a lot smaller. But because this is happening at the mega level, it's also going to happen at our micro level too. So we haven't seen that yet, really, but we got to ramp up for it. So that's one aspect of it. My concern is garbage in, garbage out, right? Like you could use the machine to generate stuff, and we've seen a lot of people do this, but they're not putting good content in. So the content that's being manipulated coming out the other end is still not the correct or accurate content. Therefore, the end product is not desirable in many instances. So I think there's a lot for us to be mindful of and aware of. I like the idea of AI agents for certain roles or certain functions. I think we could really do some great work with employee engagement through an AI agent, not through just another human, right? Human would have oversight over it, but instead of me engaging with all these different people and testing the temperature and things, I could have a system that does that, and then I'm receiving the reports while I still work on other aspects of the organization, right? So I think there's going to be some really nice fine tuning and refining of characters and roles in organizations, but we're also going to see some elimination of some roles too, or redesignation of roles. But that's always been true in every decade. We had some new technology that first off appears to be threatening everyone's well-being, like, oh, we're all going to lose our jobs. That's the gut reaction. In reality, it takes a small chunk of the industry out, and it requires a new repurposing of that. So we don't know what the future is going to be like, but there's a lot of high hope and opportunity for it. So I'm excited for it to be used in the workplace with care, as a tool to supplement our humanity and our interactions, but not as a replacement, and not as, oh, this tool exists, we should check the list or the box that we're taking care of our people's engagement levels by using the tool. Like, if you're not into it, you're not into it. So just don't mess with it. Either commit or leave it alone, type of thing.
Yeah. So to me, that's about being, hopefully you can hear me.
Yep.
Okay, good. To me, that's about being honest with yourself around what's my intention here. Being clear in your decision-making process and being conscious about it, and not just defaulting to an old habit or an old pattern. It's being very intentional.
Yeah, what I hope happens, and I'm not sure this will happen, I hope it helps people get stronger and better instead of giving up and thinking and processing, right? I hope that if they put something in a generator or to a machine, it comes out the other end and they learn some lessons from it in terms of quality writing, quality concepts, that just because you put it into the machine and it comes out. I fight with it all the time. I was just on before you and I were on, I was on LinkedIn trying to have some conversations and connections with some people. And I sometimes look at what the AI recommendation is, and it just reminds me of the risk of relying on it without reading it. 9.5 times out of 10, I won't use it at all, because I find that my skill and craft is sufficient enough, and there's a level of humanity to it that if I use the test, it's just like, hey, try our AI gen on LinkedIn to see if we can improve it, and it takes it out of context. It shifts it the wrong direction. We're not quite there yet, but I worry about that fear of people just accepting and being done, whereas I accept, or I hit the preview and go, that was a good idea. That gives me a little bit better word structure. I understand how I can use this better in the future, so I don't have to rely on it. Like, so I've gotten to the point where I've thrown something into a generator, say, help me rewrite this, and it's come back and said, actually, this is in great shape. You don't need to do anything with it, which is kind of cool. But I don't think that's the case for everyone.
Yeah. Yeah. No. No, indeed. Um, Related to that, what do you think are the implications for leaders in decision making in particular when you're looking at both AI, but AI and even without AI, but just the whole evolution of HR? Because as governance models change,
Mhm.
the role of AR morphs and evolves, and certainly
Mhm.
in distributed organizations, there isn't really one because a whole lot of the things that you need HR for are handled
Mhm.
through the governance
Yeah,
system.
yeah,
So where do you see what's the trajectory or what's the potential path that HR could go, given a dynamic, or maybe it's not so dynamic in North America because there's this, holding on to the old stuff, but holding on to control more
yeah,
specifically. But there is in those places that are adopting distributed governance models.
yeah, yeah. I think about it. So my first thought, my first gut reaction when you were asking this was, you know what, someone could replace me with this. But then I was thinking, wait, no, they can't, because they still wouldn't know what to do or how to use it. So let me use an example of our models. Our models are available on our website for people to use and kind of gain inspiration from, and if they can apply it, they can go for it for sure. But they don't have my expertise, my lived experiences, my perspective to put them to work the way we can put them to work. And I think that's true too. So I was thinking about hiring. We assist organizations with hiring, as it relates to fit and a variety of other measures. And one of the things we help them with is questioning strategy. That's something I could turn to AI real quick and have them generate a questioning strategy, a list of 20 questions to ask this, this potential manager that we're looking at. But you also have, once again, input. The quality of the input is the quality of the output, and so uh, would someone be able to really make great use out of those, as opposed to sufficient use out of those, without the background, the mindset, the knowledge, right? So at some level, we still have to continue to prioritize our intellectual capital as we make sense out of what the machines are doing. So I think for leaders that um, are particularly interested in certain aspects of leadership, that have this growth mindset, that are pretty well read without any real formal training, they can do some great things to really help their team. But once again, that takes time and it takes attention, and that's also making the assumption that they have the wherewithal to do this, right? So one of the challenges we encounter is that many leaders, good people, good hearts, trying their best, just don't have a base in leadership. They've moved into that, and they've had a dusting of courses here and a mentor and a coach, and they're not necessarily, comprehensive. So they're still just, when you rank the priorities of the work, let's just take a presidency at the university. Good heart, good intention, well meaning, but like learning leadership tactics, competencies, expanding leadership acumen is not usually a priority at that level because they've kind of made it. And it's more at a hobby level, in my opinion, for
Mm,
many people, because their day-to-day job is working with the legislature, getting budgets
mm,
approved. You know what I mean? Like
yeah.
negotiations, stuff like that. So it just so happens to be that leadership and the psychology of work is in the top three things that I'm most interested in. Also, what I do. I'd say for a lot of people, a lot of leaders, it might be something they're definitely interested in. It's like the person that reads the book but can't live the actions of the book. They can't take the conversation from the book and do anything more than regurgitate it because they don't. It's not a high enough integrated priority in their life because they have to do their job, which makes a lot of sense.
Mhm, mhm. So with the way you describe it, it almost feels like bolt-on leadership versus leadership that's integrated to, I
Yeah.
mean, a way of just seeing the world as a place for
Yep.
you to take yourself out and make a difference.
Yeah.
In
But I'm happy with bolt on as opposed to nothing, right? Like
yeah, yeah, it's
we
true.
got to start somewhere with people, and
That's true.
good
Yeah.
hearts and a good scaffolding of leadership and development can really do a lot for an organization. We're just trying to play the intermediary in this, realizing that they don't have a lot of time to pay attention to this. So
Hmm.
how can I make their job easier based on delivering some knowledge-based solutions?
Right. Right. Rob, I want to turn now to performance.
Yeah.
There are certain places that if I mention the word performance, people feel nauseous. They've been, someone's taken out the whipping stick and just thrashed them, and said, okay, you must perform, and look at those metrics, and it's data driven, and there's just no intuition operating in the organization at all.
Yeah.
So they're not picking up on any of the clues and cues.
Mm-hmm.
What's the, you know, there's a lot of nuances in the word performance. When you look at sticking it inside organizations, kind of organizations that you might be dealing with, how do you see that changing as the workforce coming up, which is highly creative? The cohort of youth are highly creative, and they're being thrust through a more traditional model of governance that really doesn't value that level of creativity. It seems to be more stuck in follow the rules and you'll be fine. Yeah. So can we redefine performance in the context of today's world?
I don't know if we could
or play with it.
refine. I think we have to recognize that there's certain eras of leadership practice and management practice and even like this concept of power over people. You will do this. This will be the metric. This is how it's going to be, without any humanism around it. That's what we have to solve. And that's why when I try to pitch myself to people, I believe in organizational performance, because if we don't perform, we can't cut a paycheck for someone, right? And so this isn't necessarily a right. It's that we have some outcomes and deliverables that we're responsible for within a time frame. So when I'm trying to pitch our services, I'm trying to focus on, look, we can drive performance, but not at the expense of an individual's success, humanity. I believe that we can have these conversations where we prioritize performance and prioritize human thriving and flourishing in the organization at the same time. And then, if anything, we know that we nurture that culture, we nurture that human flourishing, the performance is going to be a lot easier to swallow. The demands will become a lot easier to swallow because we know they're well-intentioned where they're coming from. I just had a piece published this week by Spark Magazine that I titled, "What if culture is the strategy when it comes to strategic planning?" And I'd really like to see some organizations really embrace that, because most organizations I work with have to focus on culture before they get to their strategy, or concurrently, because it's the culture, it's the lack of understanding of resource allocations, connections, stuff like that, that is squashing their ability to be successful with their strategy. Other organizations, they're told to have strategic initiatives, but there's not a lot of maneuvering and flexibility that they can do within the organization, that their job, let's say like a nonprofit, really is mission fulfillment. So instead of focusing on things that are not attainable or they're not realistic, let's focus on things internally in this organization that we can enhance, such as culture, climate, stuff like that, that bring more joy to our people, that will therefore help them be better stewards of our mission. So we can't get rid of performance. I talk about performance similar to I talk about lowercase t trauma with employees, right? So some employees come into organizations and they say, well, I'm traumatized from my last organization. I said, let's just be really clear about this. Is it capital T trauma or is it lowercase t trauma? Because we'll talk about this for a bit, but it's time for us to move on if it really is lowercase t trauma. Same things with performance, same things with culture. I saw someone the other day that says, screw culture, give me a hardworking person. And it's like, there's not one or the other. Like, I want a hardworking person that loves their job, that has energy at home at the end of the day to go home to be with their family or friends or volunteer or get to the gym. What I don't want to see is an organization prioritizing performance and people having to throw other people under the bus to protect their own kind of job security. And then they leave as empty shells and go home at the end of the day, sit on the couch, say, with their kids and not be present, because there's nothing left for them to give. Like that. And we've been there. I've been there. Like, I think we've all been there, and we've have generations of experiences of that, with how some of industries functioned over time. I think we're better than that. We have a better knowledge base now, and understanding of what's needed. And it doesn't mean one can't exist. Only one thing's a winner here, and that's performance. I've seen the other side of it too. Oh, we're so culture focused. We're so we focused that we've deprioritized the organizational functions so we could have fun, and that's wrong. Also, we have to find the balance of the two.
Yeah, it's funny. I as you're speaking, I'm thinking of a diagram I drew up, and I haven't figured out how to. I'll try reproducing it for the video part. But there's two spots here. You've got either or,
Mm-hmm.
and then above that is the and.
Mm-hmm.
So this whole business of the separate duality of it's either this or it's that just sort of ignores the fact that we're in a complex area. The nature of the character of the context is complex. So that's where the third point comes in, just to sort of say it, and it's an and. So it can be, it really starts to connect the dots when you're looking at any particular situation, I suspect. So
when has either or ever served us well, right?
Exactly.
Like, if that, going back to my comment about my students, that one of the things I think we do a good job is painting the gray and all the shades of gray, because that's what life is. And if we think it's an either or phenomenon, we're either shortcutting ourselves, or we're shortcutting our community, our clients, our students, our family. You know what I mean? Yeah. And we need to spend, and actually that's one of the challenges right now. I think we have such a push from one side to say it's gray, 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 and then we have this other perspective that it's either or, and both on the far ends of the paradigm are problematic. We need to find that balance between the two.
Yeah, totally agree. I'm going to throw one more word at you.
Yeah.
And I'll set it up by saying that, the headline diversity, DEI, as it's been bundled up in the HR field or in the organizational field. If we pull out the word diversity, it's essential for complex decision making. It's essential for decision making in complex environments, period. Without that, you don't have any durability, you don't have any resilience. You're assuming that your way, my way, or the highway is good, is the best strategy. With diversity, how are organizations handling diversity of thought, diversity of worldview in the HR, in the context of HR, or just in the context of organizational behavior? What are you observing there?
I think we're scrambling a lot here, because we have a number of different camps. We have pro camps and against camps, and then even within those camps, there's factions of sub camps, right? There's all these different schools of thoughts and methodologies. This is what I know. What I know is that too often it's easy to become too insular and surround yourself with people that agree with you out of a power function, because they don't want to rock the boat. And our most successful leaders are saying, hey, look, I don't want you just to tell me yes. I want to nurture some psychological safety in our organization. I want to hire you, or I have hired you, because you bring different worldviews, perspectives, experiences to us. And I want us to openly discuss those, so we find the best path forward for whatever it is we're attempting to tackle. And we see organizations doing that really well. We also see organizations struggling with that, and they've historically struggled with that. I believe in the value of the diversity of the thought and perspectives and vantage points and all of these things. And we can't just say one thing's more important than the other. We have to see them out. We have to hear them out. We have to use a lens of critical inquisition when we're looking at these things to determine what's going to best serve us. And what are these factors? And one of the things we do is we do a lot of behavioral assessments and personality assessments that help introduce how people behave, think, act differently. Because that's diversity in and of itself, in a different aspect that oftentimes people don't think about. And so that's where our contribution is to start to bring light to how we're different, how we're similar, how some of our similarities trip us up, how some of our differences create challenges, and then what are the paths forward and the solutions as it relates to that. And it's such a tough topic because anything on a mega scale is that much more difficult. So let's just compare it to return to work, right? Return to work orders, right? These organizations are so huge that so whether it's return to work or diversity, it's just or anything else in between, we're finding that we didn't do the right work before COVID across the board enough in this human space, in this human condition culture space. And so now we haven't fixed anything. So now we're trying to be agile or we're not trying to be agile. We've lost that ability when we get too big. And we're just trying to respond to what's needed. And that's where we're seeing that it's an all or nothing. Let's get rid of all DEI things, or let's get rid of all remote working, because it's just such a big organization to manage the nuances of it. And we don't spend time with those groups. They're just too big. We like to see direct. We'll work with their teams at a sub level, but we like working with organizations where we have a real direct influence over, that we could have day in and day out calls with them to talk to them. Hey, Rob, I don't know what to do about this. Can you give me some advice or walk me through this problem? And we know what it's going to look like on the other end.
Yeah, intriguing. I mean, one of my observations is that in environments where you've got a lot of diversity of view and worldview and opinion and whatever else, as long as there's a willingness to forge toward a bigger goal, then you really start elevating the skill set. So the simplest way to handle it is to say there is none. It's all going to be made of my way or the highway. I mean, what's worked before will work now, and it'll work on forever. And that's that's just naive, to be honest. If I can say it directly, it's pretty naive, because that means as long as you're in charge, you're the little dictator, then you're fine. But as soon as you bring in anybody else into the organization, you can't get anything done, because you don't know how to talk to those differences and to bring them in and really look at and focus on something bigger collectively, which is where the action is. That's where the real action is, and the real performance as well.
Yeah. I have a love-hate relationship with the term purpose. I struggle when we start integrating purpose initiatives at the individual level, because if you take something as just simple as Maslow, not everyone's at a purpose level. So it's not going to make sense to them why we're having these purpose conversations at work on an individual. What's your purpose stuff? My purpose might be, I'm trying to survive right now and get out alive, and hopefully my kids have food, like that. Whereas someone else is like very, self-actualizing type of purpose type. My preference is that we talk about purpose in our team, in our organization. And this is the beauty of working with nonprofits, right? Mission specific work drives purpose. And it's nice when we can pull a diverse group of people together to say, how are we going to live and fulfill this purpose for our community, clientele, whatever it is. And so I think that is a real grounding element for any team, regardless of its level of diversity or thought or whatever, is that we know that teams that are oriented towards purpose as at the team level are much more successful than those that aren't. But I'd like to keep that separate than purpose, personal purpose. Like there's workshops, there's groups, there's organizations we work with that look at that, but my clients aren't at that spot where they're doing individual self-development in the work time, because they have too much team and organizational development to be focusing on.
Right. Yeah, I get that. I mean, and I noticed that also in the facilitation work, is you're seeing layers of application, personal and then organizational, team, whatever. It always answers the question, why are we doing this? So because if you don't ask that question, you don't see the connections between what you're doing and what somebody else is doing. You kind of get caught up in a very insular view. So, yeah.
Yep.
Rob, thank you. Anything else you'd like to add?
Oh, I don't know. There's so much to talk about. It's so fun. Like I just, Dawna, we've done this a few times, and
You've been
and
so
it's
patient
just
with me. Thank you.
it's fun to connect with people that want to talk about these things. I do want to acknowledge, though, I think we have to be mindful. So when we talk about AI and all these other things and self-awareness and self-development, it's important for us to recognize that, look, the people watching this show, the people that are following me, the people that are following you, we're kind of drinking the same Kool-Aid, right? Like there's an element of self-development, ongoing growth. We need to be careful with this as things become more complicated moving forward, because it's possible that we're going to move in a direction, a trajectory that's different than another large population of the general population, right?
Mm,
And
yeah.
and so it's easy to become high and mighty and look, I've figured things out, and why haven't you yet? So I think there's a element of humility that needs to be practiced among us, and a mindful factor there that this makes sense to us. We like this, but there's others out there that might not like it. It's kind of like, it reminds me of when I was a teenager and my dad just hated my music, right? There's different tastes for different people, different practices for different people. And I've tried to move out of that judgment zone altogether and just say it all has its place and its purpose at times. And I'm not a person to levy an opinion on this. I can let you do who you are and what you are, and that's fine. And I hope others can be at that same spot too.
Yeah, I appreciate that. My version of it is keep an open mind, even when it
Yeah.
conflicts with your own, particularly when it conflicts with your own. Just keep an open mind and take it in, and then you can do your reflection work afterwards to see, because there's always value in every conversation. I can remember the first time I was with friends, and their son came over, and he was a kind of a punk rocker from Calgary,
Yeah.
in Western Canada. So
Yeah.
province over.
Fish out of water,
Oh my
right?
gosh, and he had played on his
Yeah.
chains, and his hair was a mohawk, and I was terrified. But I thought, well, there's some and it turns out that the kids that were dressed like that were dressed to scare you, were
Yeah.
the most sensitive. They were
Yeah.
the ones that brought so much insight, but they'd had so much pushback from society as a whole that this was their safety net. This was how they
Yeah.
protected themselves. And I think that we were going to see that kind of parallel in organizations as well.
Yeah.
People who act out aren't necessarily bad or misbehaving or performance problems. They are
Yeah.
simply issuing a cry for help and or a cry for care. Show
Yeah.
up, be present.
Yeah.
This one of the universal principles, just show, pay attention to what has heart and meaning, is the second one. And
Yeah.
that, I think, is really important today, to just listen with the heart, and to balance this data with how much we care about what's going on in the organizations and the teams, and at every level.
Yeah, if I could share two different things as it relates to that. I like what my wife says when we're doing workshops, and she says we have two ears and one mouth for a reason. And I know this isn't the innate reason, but this is a great argument that speak half as much as you listen. I have a friend, she's lovely, and she was sharing with me that her daughter was looking to move out east to go to college. And she told me that, and I said, well, that's wonderful. That's how exciting. And she said, Rob, you're the first person that's shared that reaction with me. Everyone else told us how we're making wrong decisions and it's a bad idea. And to me, that's what I want us to stop doing.
Mm-hmm.
Keep your comments to yourself if you're not going to build someone up, right?
Yeah.
This is a wonderful opportunity for someone to go explore who they are and who they want to be.
Mm-hmm.
My opinion really doesn't matter in this. And that's something I think we've lost with our social media, that we have our opinion platforms and we hear a lot of similar angst and anger and opinions. And, if I could just end on that I want us to be more kind and caring and build people up, as opposed to the fact that I have an opinion doesn't matter in most conversations.
Yeah, beautiful. Nicely contributed. I'm going to turn you off camera right now and just
Okay.
close this. I'll be right back with you, though.
Okay.
One sec. So thank you very much for listening to my conversation with Dr. Rob Lyon. Please subscribe to the channel if you're listening to this on YouTube, and if you're listening to it on the podcast platforms, any one of them, Spotify, all the other ones, please subscribe, comment, review. Love to see your comments. And thank you for joining us. Great fun.